Hey guys, welcome back to another Why No One Plays video. Today is going to be a remake of an older episode. As a matter of fact, I'll be remaking the first official episode of the Why No One Plays series all the way back from 2020. A month or two ago, I made a community post asking if you guys would be cool with me remastering older Why No One Plays episodes. The level of quality and production for some of the earlier ones, particularly before my channel took off in early 2021, weren't as well made as I would like them to be. Thankfully, the consensus was that you would be happy to see them, and seeing as I've done remakes before that and they also did quite well, I thought it would be worthwhile to make a refurbished episode on arguably the least played champion in all of League of Legends. While not the most innovative champion in the game, it can be difficult to fathom how Skarner has such a poor representation across all divisions when there are others with equally, if not more stat-checky designs than him. Several adjustments were made to his kit throughout the years, but apart from a minor blip in early Season 8, Skarner's average pick rate is so low that very often he doesn't even appear on tier lists due to there being too small a sample size to accurately gauge him. Why does he have such a low play rate despite being quite effective at what he does? We'll be finding that out today in the newly remade Why No One Plays Skarner. What I find interesting about Skarner is that his class designation is listed as a diver, yet he doesn't give off the impression of one. I would closer akin him to a Juggernaut, attributing to the absence of a dash and option for a general tank build with perhaps one damaging item like Black Cleaver or something. Ordinarily, that would be standard fare for most Juggernauts. At the same time, you'd be hard-pressed to give him the same raid boss status that you would a Darius or Mordekaiser. He's a curious one for sure, having a kit that's in many ways unique while being easy to understand. You can make the case that he's a diver since the main goal for him is to charge headfirst at a priority target and lock them down using his E and ultimate. Though he doesn't have a dash, he has tempo, kind of like Olaf. Then again, unlike most other divers, Skarner has very high persistent damage by virtue of Crystal Slash, dealing max health damage to all enemies around him with an extremely low cooldown. Granted, it was only recently they changed his Q to do percent health damage. I say recently, it was back in Season 10. This would characterize him as a Juggernaut. You can also make the assumption that he's a catcher, given he spends most of the game making picks by stunning and snatching his position targets. Whatever label you want to give him, Skarner tends to deliver. Personally, I would go down the route of a Juggernaut, as he's closest to that subclass than any other, and it's also the reason why he struggles to garner a substantial following compared to his peers. Juggernauts are popular for their reliability and consistency. You can always depend on them to exert and draw pressure for the team without needing the permission of anyone or having to wait for anything. They're always raring to go. Those among the class who aren't played a lot like Illaoi and Yorick are such because of their need for setup. Even then, their ultimates grant some semblance of on-demand pressure, Illaoi getting tentacles with every champion struck and Yorick spawning ghouls alongside his maiden. The class is meant to be just that, reliable. It's imperative for their kit to be as consistent as possible, having nothing that would cause drastic shifts in power as that would defeat the purpose of the class, given it's known for having many stat checkers. Looking through Skarner's kit, there are many ways he can fluctuate from devastatingly powerful to pathetically weak, more so than a lot of other Juggernauts, and it's all thanks to his passive. Crystal Spires is a textbook example of how creativity should never compromise practicality, more so in a competitive title. It wouldn't be a stretch to say this passive is one of the most unique abilities in the entire game. That just so happens to hinder him more than it helps. When Skarner is present in a match, Crystal Spires are set at 6 points on the map, one near the red and blue buffs on both sides, and one near the 2 epic monster pits. Crystal Spires behave in a capture point style, whereby standing on it for a second and a half, it switches control in favor of your team while granting vision of its radius and awarding a paltry sum of gold. For the other 9 champions, the Spires are purely for vanity's sake, if not a token bit of vision. But for Skarner, gaining control over a Crystal Spire is of paramount importance, as it houses one of the best combat steroids in the game. While standing within range of a Spire controlled by his team, he gains flat bonus movement speed, a staggering amount of attack speed especially in the late game, and effectively the mana regeneration of a blue buff if not more. The difference between fighting a Skarner with and without the aid of a Crystal Spire is night and day, as it not only augments his fighting capabilities but also his threat range, letting him chase down priority targets at a speed few if any could outpace. At first glance, this seems like a rather intuitive objective. The goal of a jungler is to establish control of the map in favor of their team as much as possible. By gaining priority in the jungle, you can embolden your laners to push further, play more aggressively, and rotate faster for skirmishes and team fights. Skarner, like any jungler, naturally will traverse the map, so it doesn't seem like too big of an inconvenience for him to have to activate these pillars. That is, if they were a luxury, not a necessity. Power spikes to this degree are pretty common among Juggernauts. Darius' Noxian Might gives him a boost of up to 230 bonus attack damage in the late game. That's over 8,000 gold in stats. And while I'm sure he'd very much like to have this passive active at all times, he's still a threat without it, especially in the early to mid game, forcing the enemy team to be wary of him regardless of whether he does or doesn't have it. The threat of Noxiamite alone is enough to intimidate the opposing team from a protracted engagement. Aatrox is also the same with World Ender. A staggering 45% bonus at rank 3 can skyrocket his attack damage to half a grand, but you still have to watch out for him in base form. Skarner's power budget, on the other hand, was allocated to where, unlike the other two, it's almost obligatory for him to have Crystal Charge active, not a bonus. Without the attack speed buff, his DPS is worse than most, if not every other Juggernaut, not to mention how fast he depletes his mana when spamming abilities. This means that if he, and by extension his team, fails to consistently hold the line, he's at a major statistical disadvantage. To alleviate this somewhat, Skarner gains a small burst of Crystal Charge after hitting a target affected by Crystal Venom or for the duration of Impale. The issue with Impale is that while I think it's a fantastic ability, the Crystal Charge you get while suppressing a target only allows you to make use of the increased movement speed, as Skarner can't basic attack during this time. The 1.25 seconds of Crystal Charge corresponds to the 1.25 seconds a target is stunned for after casting Fracture, but realistically that only gives you maybe 1 or 2 extra auto attacks. Now if you were a marksman with 300 AD and Infinity Edge, 2 extra autos make all the difference, but the bulk of Skarner's damage originates from his Q, not autos. Basically, the temporary crystal charges you get from Fracture or Impale are more nominal than functional, which I never really understood. I feel like they can increase the duration to 3 or even 2.5 seconds, and that would make the champion 1,000 times more consistent. But back to the matter at hand. Seeing as how all 10 champions can change the Spire, Skarner's team has to assist him in gaining control over them, something they may not be able to do, especially if they're in a losing lane matchup. Not only are they important for sustenance in combat, but the increased tempo as well. 70 to 120 bonus movement speed is equivalent to about a 30% speed boost, give or take. This also means that Skarner's effectiveness is greatly hindered when fighting outside of the jungle, which worsens his ganking potential as he will never passively have Crystal Charge in lane. To get the on-demand boost, he has to already be standing next to his target of interest, making his passive one of the most counterintuitive abilities in the game, and a major source of frustration for prospective players. Agency and the loss of it influences the player's experience of the game. They tend to shy away from playing any champion with elements that are out of their control, as evident by juggernauts like Illaoi, Yorick, and Skarner having far less activity than Darius, Mordekaiser, and Garen. Fluctuating power levels are only tolerable if the bottom range is equal to or maybe ever so slightly weaker than the average strength of their peers. Calling back to the aforementioned examples of Aatrox and Darius, logic dictates why play Skarner when you can play someone else who doesn't have an extrinsic element that you have little control over but is integral to your success. You can say that he has fantastic pick potential, which is true. Then again, junglers are no strangers to making picks. That's the purpose of their role. If your goal is to single out a priority target rather than suppressing them, most players would prefer to outright kill them. So champions like Evelynn, Rengar, Rek'Sai, Kha'Zix, Talon, and so on look way more appealing than Skarner by comparison. This is where we encounter his second problem. Skarner is simultaneously the most unique champion in the game and also the most superfluous. Conceptually, his repertoire has a ton of interesting applications, but in a practical setting, none of them stand out. For there to be a solution, there needs to be a problem first, and Skarner is a solution for a non-existent problem. To elaborate, let's take a look at a fellow suppression champion, Malzahar. Even though he struggles to find representation, he has a greater incentive to be played. The mid lane is a more DPS area control focused role than the jungle. As a result, most of its members are easy targets for assassination. Malz is one of the rare few mid laners who can thwart such threats with his ultimate, the others being Vex and maybe Lissandra. He's an anti-engaged mid laner, and there aren't that many of those. Skarner's niche is making picks and locking down enemies with Impale and Fracture, in a role where champions who can do that are in high abundance. After all, the best crowd control in the game is death. Instead of freezing someone in place and hoping your teammates can do the job, you may as well just do it yourself. Another niche is combat, which I think is the more underrated aspect about him. Skarner's a beast. While Crystal Slash doesn't look very impressive, towards the mid to late game you'll notice your health bar melting while he's taking barely any damage at all. Crystalline Exoskeleton is a rather intriguing shield. If you have around 40% cooldown reduction, which I believe is around the neighborhood of maybe 70 ability haste, Skarner's shield can refresh itself before running out, letting you essentially have that shield up at all times. Given that Skarner's current build is Lucidity Boots, Black Cleaver, and Jak'Shul, he has no trouble getting 40% cooldown reduction. Also, the higher his ability haste, the more often he can CC chain you with Fracture, making him deceptively hard to beat in a 1v1 scenario. That being said, even though Skarner's damage output and durability are both frankly terrifying, damage is once again not in short supply, especially in this day and age. Jungle in particular is filled with divers, assassins, and skirmishers who can and will mess you up. They may not have this same extended scrapping power as Skarner, but they don't need to. Actually, that's debatable. Champions like Bel'Veth, Kindred, and Master Yi will consistently overshadow Skarner in DPS, although humorously, Skarner excels at shutting down hyper carries. Whatever the case, the running problem with Skarner is that he's a champion who requires more steps and more conditions to reach optimal level, yet that optimal level doesn't exceed that of his peers by a wide enough margin to justify the effort required. Furthermore, there's the previously talked about hurdle of control over Crystal Spires being out of your hands more often than not. Typically, having elements of luck is not a bad thing in and of itself. As an example, Kindra's marks are for the most part entirely RNG at varying thresholds. You might get lucky with convenient mark placements, or you might not. That doesn't matter as much as one would think though. A Challenger Kindra one trick with only 4 marks can easily outplay a Bronze first time Kindra with 12, because the champion takes an exorbitant amount of mechanical execution to be piloted perfectly. Skarner is a stat checker, the one class where you don't want to have inconsistent elements. Stat checkers have very minimal micromechanics. Where their difficulty lies is macromechanics. Your combos won't change all that much. Instead, you have to know when to go in, who to target, and how much punishment you can take before you fall. If your guess is accurate, then you win. If it's not, then you lose. Simple as that. You can't outplay your way through a fight as a stat checker outside of universal things like dodging skill shots. It's cut and dry. Do you have the numbers to kill this person, survive this attack, or not? It's in your best interest to be at your strongest before doing anything as a stat checker. Subsequently, being unable to access your strongest at any point in time no matter how skilled you are begs the question, why bother playing someone like that in the first place when you can play someone who can access their strongest point at all times. I've had a few Skarner mains talk about how they wish they had the old Crystal Charge instead, where instead of the bonus attack and movement speed being attached to Crystal Spires, it will be attached to his Q. For the uninitiated, the old Crystal Slash had a stacking effect where if you struck an enemy, you would get bonus attack and movement speed for 5 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. So essentially, it's very similar to Hecarim's Rampage, where the more you use it in succession, the stronger it gets. While that won't do anything to address his second problem of not standing out, it would at least fix the first one, which may be just enough to get people to try him out. Too much of his power budget is allocated to something he has no control over. Though I understand Riot's intention behind Crystal Spires making him more unique, once again, creativity should never compromise practicality. They can keep the mana regeneration on the Spires and maybe even the movement speed, but at the very least, the attack speed should move to Crystal Slash. Of course, there are still tons of more minute details that affect his popularity, but I'd imagine a lot of them will be addressed once his visual gameplay update comes out. Whenever it comes out. If it will ever come out. But assuming they're willing to give his current iteration some more attention, what I think they should do for the time being is move his attributes around a bit. Skarner is by no means a bad champion, it's mainly that his design doesn't really correspond to the attitude or mindset of a jungler in terms of selection. While he does have a gimmick, the landscape he's in diminishes the value of it. Combining that with how inconsistent he can be at times makes it far too risky to have him as a pocket pick, much less a main. The goal of jungle is to establish control of the map, not just the jungle, the entire map. Forcing Skarner's power into select areas of the jungle ironically hurts his performance as a jungler. There's definitely room for Crystal Spires to exist, but they shouldn't be as consequential as they are right now. Otherwise, junglers will decide to play someone who doesn't rely on environmental conditions to do their job, and there's a lot of them. If you're looking for a tank, you have Zac, Sejuani, Rammus. If you're looking for damage, you have basically everyone else. Skarner's pick potential has the possibility of standing out, but it never will until we fix his inconsistency. That's all I have to say for today. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about Skarner, if you agree or disagree with my points. As always, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Really helps me out. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsVerum, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.